Hello everyone, this is Arman with MetaSpike. Thanks for joining. If we could do a quick sound check to make sure my voice is coming through, if you could tell me on the chat that everything's okay, we'll be good to start. All right, I got some confirmation that everything's looking good. So thanks for joining. Today's agenda is to talk about some of the new things we introduced in Forensic Email Collector's most recent couple of versions, get into some detail on the intricacies of those features and some things that trip people up, and answer some common questions that we get all the time. And then we're going to look at some of the new features that are coming up soon in version 3.10. And when I say soon, I mean probably in the next week or so. We're testing it now. And I'm actually going to use the new version in this demo for the most part to show you what's coming up, some exciting features. So I'll start by sharing my screen really quickly. 1 second. All right. So the first thing that I want to show you is Google Drive functionality. This is something that we added to FEC in the last version. And in 3.9, there was actually a limitation that you could only do Google Drive acquisitions if you were either using Delegation with G Suite, or if you had your own Gmail API credentials. That was because our access to Drive API by Google hadn't been approved just yet, but now we have that approval. So in 3.10, this will be built in to FEC's internal credentials. So you'll be able to do Drive attachment acquisitions without doing anything special. So I'm going to walk you through an acquisition like that, where we'll collect some Google Drive material, Google Drive attachments, and show you the output, what the output looks like, and what some of the things to watch out for are. So I'm going to start by launching FEC here. And let's see, let me bring that into view. So let's put a target mailbox that we have, that we always use in webinars and demos. So when we hit next, now the new option that you see is this fetch drive attachments option. So if you check this option, we don't check it by default because we figure it may not be necessary in most of the cases. And it does have a slight overhead that each message has to be examined to determine if it does contain some drive attachments. So it's not necessary to do it. Well, it doesn't make sense to do it if it's not necessary. So we check it in this case. And I'm going to leave this case information fields empty and move on. Let's pick an output path like this. So when we're prompted for authentication, you'll see that there's an additional item here now that says see and download all your Google Drive files. So that's something new. That is the piece of authentication for Google Drive. And also, yeah, so let's actually say allow to this and close out of it. So here we see the mailbox, we see the Google calendars associated with it. I'm going to just do a regular plain Gmail acquisition here. When I say next, let me start this actually. There are two new things here. Towards the bottom of this progress screen, there's an item that says remaining drive attachments, and on the bottom there's total drive attachments. You'll notice that in the beginning, those are both 0 because at the onset we don't know how many emails with Google Drive attachments we have and how many attachments will be within them. So that's something that is surfaced as FEC actually acquires those messages and examines them. So you'll see that when the email acquisition finishes in a couple of seconds, then those items that we've detected will pop up there as the number of drive attachments we found. And we're going to have an opportunity to actually automatically go and fetch them. So yeah, we found 4 there. So we're getting into the phase of downloading the attachments. Done. So we got the Google Drive attachments. Let's see what the output folder looks like. So we have the items and logs folders as usual. I'm going to get your attention here and point out the downloaded drive attachments log. So I'm going to pull this up here. So you see that this actually starts with drive ID. Let me see if I can throw this into Excel. We also have the CSV output option now, so I'll show that to you in a second. So we have the drive attachment ID, which is something we assign to the item. Parent message ID is the ID of the message where we found this attachment. Service ID is Google Drive's internal ID for that item. This is where we output the message. These are the hashes we calculated for each item. This is the MIME type. So this is kind of important because items on Google Drive have different types, and the types that go like application PDF are originally external files. So this is a PDF file that I imported into Google Drive myself as a PDF. Whereas these other items that start with Google Apps, these are files that originated in Google Drive, like a Google Docs file or a Google spreadsheet that were created in Google Drive, and they're actually exported in different formats like Excel or PDF or Word. So in this case, this field, the MD5 from Drive field, contains the hashes that Google Drive has on these files, and it only has hashes for files that are external files. So in this case, we have a hash for this PDF, but no hashes for the originally Google generated files. And in this case, when I did my acquisition, I selected SHA-256 as my hashing algorithm. But if I select MD5 on FEC, you'll see that those 2 hashes actually match. So if you're interested in matching those, you could an MD5 acquisition and see that those hashes match. Here are the file names, and here are the creation and modification timestamps that we captured from Google Drive for these files. This last one is kind of recent because I created it late last night. And again, this real file has file size in bytes provided by Google Drive, whereas the Drive originated files don't have specific sizes. And if you look at what our output looks like, let me close out of this. On our output, we have an additional folder now that says Drive attachments. So underneath that, there are subfolders that represent the original email IDs. So this 3, for example, corresponds to message number 3. So you'll see that if you go into the message folders, this 3.eml. So it's a way to tie them together currently, the message and its attachment. So for 3, we have attachment number 1. It's this PDF file. We capture their creation and last modification dates as file system timestamps. For 146, we have 2 attachments. It's exported as a doc file, although it was originally a Google Doc. It has its creation and last modification dates captured here, and so on. So the beauty of this is clearly that the goal here is to follow those Google Drive attachment hyperlinks and track them down and acquire them along with your Gmail or G Suite acquisition. If you don't do that, because these are not real attachments to emails, then by the time the recipient of this collection gets the status set, those links might be dead, the files may be unavailable, or they simply may not have access rights to those files anymore to acquire them. So you kind of lost that evidence. So we're trying to bundle that together where you authenticate with Google Calendar, Gmail, and Google Drive at the same time, and pull Google Calendar information, pull the Gmail messages, and fetch the linked Google Drive attachments all together. So this is already in place in 3.9, requires custom credentials. In 3.10 coming up next week, you'll be able to do this with the built-in credentials. What's next for this is to build a way to actually bundle these attachments with their parent emails so that when you throw this into your processing tools, that could be a parent-child relationship automatically built in. So that's what we're thinking about, and we are soliciting feedback on this. So we have a couple of ideas as to how best to do it, but I want to hear what works best for most people. Obviously, one of the options is to create a second version of these emails, for example, the MSG file, and insert the attachments into it. But the downside of that is some of these drive attachments can be hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes in size, so they can be really large, and you would have downstream problems associated with having those emails with huge attachments. The more feasible option seems to be to bundle them in archive containers, like throw the original email message and its attachments into a zip file, for example, in addition to the originals that we capture. So if you're interested in that parent-child relationship, you can go ingest those and go from there. That's probably what we're leaning towards now because of that large attachment issue. The other thing I should mention here is that when FEC downloads these attachments, it does so in a streaming fashion, so to say. So if you have a huge attachment, it's not a problem. It doesn't try to download the whole thing and put it into memory to clog things up. It'll actually request it from Google Drive in chunks and keep writing it out. So you could download, gigabytes of attachments from Google Drive if they're linked to an email. Of course, the timing would depend on how fast Google Drive gives that information, but it is possible. So this is how drive acquisitions work. The second thing that I wanted to mention really quickly is portable mode. This is something that came up quite a bit, especially with our law enforcement users. And the request was that they said that sometimes there was a need to actually run forensic email collector on a suspect's computer directly rather than run it on an agency laptop and bring the information there. So when you run it on the target computer, then of course, there are a couple of issues there. Number one, the licensing issue, which can be solved with a dongle license. That's pretty easy. Number two, forensic email collector has some configuration files. The default config file is very small, I think a couple of kilobytes in size, but still you don't want to write anything to the target computer. So we created this portable mode now, which is really easy to activate. So what you do is, let me show you. So I have a copy of 3.9 here in a folder on my hard drive. And all it takes to activate portable mode is to create this 0-byte file named portable mode. There's nothing in it. So it just looks like an empty file. And if you look at our support documentation on this, we put a download link for this. So you could actually download a sample portable mode file from there. So what matters here is the name. So FEC checks the folder to see if there's a file named portable mode there. If it does, then when you launch it, it's going to activate portable mode, and it will say so in the title bar here. And the differences are, number one, instead of using that config file in the user's app data subfolders, it's going to create a configuration file within the folder where you're launching the executable. So it's self-contained. The key thing is you have to be on a folder where it's writable. So you don't want this to be running from the program files folder, for example. But as long as you copy this onto a flash drive, for example, then you have write access there and this will work. The second difference is any files that FEC creates due to user activity, like if you were to create some custom IMAP profiles in FEC, then the default storage location of that is still under your documents folder normally. So we change that also automatically to point them in here into that folder where you're running it from. So the idea is to keep everything self-contained to the flash drive. So what you do is essentially just copy your forensic email collector installation folder over to a flash drive, put this portable mode file there, and then you can bring your dongle for licensing. So plug the dongle in, plug the flash drive in, and run it. And the reason for the dongle requirement is not because it should also only work with a dongle, but there's the licensing issue where if you run it on the target computer, then FEC is going to look for a license. It'll check the dongle first. If there's a dongle, you're good. If there's no dongle, it's going to look for a license on the local computer. On the suspect's computer, you're not going to have that, so you're going to get stuck on the licensing. So that's why you have to have a dongle license for this to work in portable mode. So this is how it works to do the acquisitions in portable mode. I'm not going to go into the acquisition workflow because it's the same thing, but that's how you launch it. The next thing I want to talk about, again, going back to the new version of FEC that's coming up, are a couple of new features that we have lined up, and I want to get into this before we release, just both to get some feedback and also get you used to how to use that functionality. So I'm going to launch 3.10 now that we have, and the first thing that I want to talk about here is going to be search it previews. So let's say that I want to acquire a mailbox from Gmail as usual. Skip over these steps, make a target folder. I'll be asked to authenticate. Let's say yes. All right, so you know how we search normally. So to do an in-place search, we would launch this in-place search console. And here you type your search terms. You could type a single term or combine multiple terms like this. If you wanted to throw some further restrictions there, you could put some parentheses and add some time restrictions and so on. But there are a couple of issues here. Number one, it could be cumbersome to construct this if you have a long search string. You could use a text editor, but some users are not too comfortable with it. But the more important thing is sometimes our users or their clients want to know how many search hits are coming from individual terms or expressions. So let's say in this case, how many hits are coming from the term expert versus Bitcoin, or if you have even more like I have another expression here, how many of the searches are coming from that? So that becomes a little bit hard to manage, not for 2-3 terms, but if you have a long list of search terms and expressions that you're running, then it gets tricky to know how to actually measure the searches for these. So we built a new interface for this now for 3.10. You access it by clicking on this load from file link here. I call this the search it preview interface. So here you load a list of terms. So first let's go look at what that looks like. So this is just a list of terms, one term or one expression per line. So you could put a simple term like this, like one word, or you could put a more complex expression like this, or things with codes, like anything that works in Google essentially. And how complex you want to get here at the line level depends on at what level you want to get your search counts. If you want to get search counts for now I know and lose at the same time together, then you put that together. If not, then you can separate those terms and construct it differently. But I just put a variety of different expression types here just to illustrate how things work. So it's essentially just one expression or term per line. So you go load this up here. And FEC pulls that up, and at the bottom it creates an additional line for the total hits. So you have a couple of options here. The first thing you can do, if you're not interested in the search hits per term, you can just simply convert this to a query. So you can just hit this button. Then what FEC will do is it'll actually take that list and use Gmail syntax to convert that to a complete expression like this. So you could just run it to preview or skip the preview, save, and go and collect it from there. So it just makes it easier to construct a search from lines rather than create that expression yourself. The second thing you can do is you can execute this, and FEC will start executing these line by line. You can see actually in real time how they're running. And at the end, it'll say search complete, and it'll give you a total hit count as well as individual hit counts. So you could go and export this as a report if you wanted to. So you could go, I'll put this here. Let's make a new folder here called reports. It says export complete, so I'm going to go check out that report that I just reports. So it looks like this. So in this case, it's exported as a TSV file because that's the option that I selected in FEC. But you know that starting a couple of versions back, we have the option to export to CSV, TSV, and that. So you have multiple options for this as well. But I stuck with this, so I'm going to show you what this looks like. So it's essentially just a representation, a copy of what you saw in FEC's user interface with the counts and the status and everything. So this could be a handy way to generate a search hit count report from FEC. The other issue that comes up sometimes is this. Let's say that you want to run a search like this, but at the same time, you want to limit your search to something. It may be a specific time period, for example. So if you wanted to get search hit counts while your time restriction is in place, you could do something along the lines of constructing your terms in a way that each line has a limiting factor built in, like you could say expert and your time limiting expression. But to make that a little bit easier, we built a little interface here as well, and you throw your limiting expression directly in here. So let's say that I wanted to limit the search to just 2018, right? So I could do after 2018 1.1, before 2019 1.1. When I do this, you'll see that FEC actually goes and appends that limiting expression to every term that I have, so that when I get my search it counts, I can see that count for that specific term or expression in light of my limiting factor. So when I execute this now, I still get my search it counts, but I'm going to get fewer hits because I'm limiting strictly to the time period. But when you convert this to query, then FEC is smart enough to know that you don't actually have to include that limiting expression per line. You can just include it once at the beginning and end it with all the rest of the terms. So this just saves valuable query space because there's a limit to everything. So we don't want this search expression to get exceedingly long. So we just include that limiting expression just once. So at this point, you have your search it report, presumably. You could run another preview here if you wanted to, but I don't think that's necessary now because we already ran the preview in that search it preview user interface. So you can just save this query and carry on with the acquisition. You'll see that we only got the 130. That was the total hits for that search group, and done. So this makes it easier to get those search it counts and construct some more complex searches with FEC. This works for both Gmail, G Suite, and Exchange and Office 365 right now. Although Exchange searches are not as efficient as this, so they take quite a bit longer. And if you construct some really large searches, then there's a chance that you could trigger throttling in an Exchange server. So I would use that a little bit more sparingly, while Gmail seems to be pretty efficient with these searches, and you can get a search it report very quickly. So this is the next big thing that's coming. You should expect this, I would say, probably early next week. Let me pause here to see. I have a couple of questions here, so let me read those really quickly. First, that was a question about going back to the drive acquisition. How does the drive acquisition work for the drive docs if your export is PST? That's a good question. Right now, that doesn't affect anything because, like I said earlier, we're not burying those Google Drive attachments into the acquired messages themselves. So you would have the PST version, you would have the EML or MSG versions, and then on the side, you still have the drive attachments folder separately and outside. But when we think about bundling, then the PST question is going to be more of an interesting challenge. So again, do we put that in the PST or do we keep it outside so that you throw them into your forensic analysis tools or e-discovery tools separately? I'm more inclined to say separately, but I'm interested to hear what people's feedback is on this. So feel free to email me or message me on LinkedIn or something, and we'll talk more about this. The second thing that I hear here, the second question is, can we calculate unique hits and does searching work in Yahoo? So unique hits, let's see. Well, not in this interface. So right now what we're doing is we are actually calculating search hits per expression and then combining each line with an OR. So essentially each line is getting you the specific hits that correspond to that line, but that doesn't say that any hits that you see in that line are not present in any other line. So if you wanted to get something like that, then you would have to construct your search expression in a way that you exclude the rest of the term. So that would be more complicated, but you could do it. Not automatically with FEC, but you could construct a search along the lines of, first search expression, not the rest of the expression, and get your unique hits there. But the interface that I just showed you doesn't automatically get you that unique hits per term. While we stopped here, I think I saw another question here. If the link is for the folder, does it download everything inside the folder? One of the users asks. I don't think I get that, Mike. If you would elaborate on that a little bit, are you saying if the link is for a folder in Google Drive attachments? I would have to know a little bit more about. Oh yeah, so he's talking about a Google Drive folder. Right now, what we tested and developed is mostly around links to individual files. I actually wasn't aware that you could create a Google Drive folder link as your attachment and refer to all the files under it. I don't know if that's possible, but based on your question, it sounds like it might be. So I'm going to look into that to see what we would do if that's the case, if that's even possible. Right now, the functionality is there to actually tackle. Oh yeah, Mike is guessing if this is based on his experience in OneDrive. So in Google Drive, my experience has been that you point to the individual files in Drive and attach them individually. So that's the workflow here, and you just go and fetch those links to the individual files and acquire them along with the emails, not at the folder level currently. All right, so let's get back to the new features here. So we did the search terms, and like I said, the searching works on all providers. Yahoo, that was another question. So Yahoo, Gmail, G Suite, Exchange, Office 365. This new search interface for creating these bulk searches and getting search reports is applicable to Gmail, G Suite, and Exchange, Office 365 right now. Theoretically, it could be built for IMAP, although it would be quite a bit more complicated because of the way IMAP searches are constructed. And also, we're not inclined to push this kind of blanket keyword searching on IMAP that much because there is a little bit tricky. IMAP servers have a lot more restrictions on what you can search, and their performance is very different. So, generally, I don't encourage running this kind of blanket searches on IMAP servers. I think it's more appropriate to use that for simple limiting factors like limiting by subject or dates and things like that. So I haven't really had the need for or a request for this kind of a search report scenario for an IMAP server yet. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is, again, something coming up in the next version. Let's say that I'm collecting some emails from a provider. It could be anything, but in this case, I'm going to stick with an Exchange server here. So I'm going to put in my, well, let's hold that thought for a second. Right before this, let me go over something in Exchange that comes up a lot in the current features. Let's talk about that for about 2 seconds. And then let's get into this new feature because it kind of ties in together. So I'm going to talk very briefly about Exchange, delegation, and impersonation for a couple of reasons. Number one, we get a lot of questions on this. Number two, FEC actually has 3 modes of access to target mailboxes, and sometimes one of those modes at least gets overlooked. So I want to emphasize that and also show how you activate that. So let's do this real quick. Let's say that I want to acquire the emails of a mailbox in Exchange. So let's say I'm targeting this mailbox, right? So I have 3 ways to access this. Number one is to use this user's own credentials. So in this case, I'm targeting me, Bromit Metaspike. I could use vBrom's own credentials, or maybe I am vBrom, and I can either use auth to do the auth authentication, or I can uncheck this and put in the username and password and go from there. So this way is the traditional regular authentication method. If I go and change this to somebody else's email, and if I don't check this impersonation checkbox, then now I'm in delegate access mode. So I'm using delegation in Exchange to access vBrom's mailbox through a Gunger's mailbox. So delegate access is something that you set up at the individual user level. So you go into a Gunger's mailbox or Exchange account, and you say specifically, this user has full access rights to vBrom's mailbox. So you could exercise that right not only in FEC, but also in Outlook web app or in Outlook. So you can mount another user's mailbox and work with it, essentially. So FEC supports that, and you can use the delegate access exactly in this manner. Just put in the different users' username and password, and you're good. The third method, which is usually overlooked, is this impersonation method. So if you check this, then we're using a different thing called impersonation, which is not the same as delegation. Impersonation is set up at the company or enterprise level, and you set up a service account typically, and you give that account rights to do application impersonation. And then you can use that account to impersonate other users and access their mailboxes. But this is not something that the end user can exercise through Outlook web app or Outlook. It's mostly an API thing. And it has a couple of differences from delegate access. I would say the most important difference is as it pertains to quotas. So Exchange servers have quotas for throttling. And if you use delegation, then every time you use your admin account to do delegate access to other target accounts, then you're using that admin account's quota. Whereas if you use a service account, then you're sharing that quota across the different targets. So you're not going to be throttled as quickly. And of course, if you have control over the environment in Exchange, it's possible to adjust your throttling policies too. So if you know that you're getting into a large Exchange acquisition, it might make sense to work with the IT department there to adjust throttling to allow some more leeway there. So that's something to consider. Another benefit of impersonation is you set it up once. So you set it up at the company level, and if new mailboxes are added to the enterprise, then you don't have to worry about setting delegate access to those new mailboxes to get going. You're already set. You just set up your service account with the right permissions, and you can access whatever you need. So I wanted to show you that distinction. And all of these workflows work both with credentials and auth. So you could still be on auth and still use delegation or impersonation if you wanted to. And the authentication would just go through that web-based authentication workflow. So having said that, now let's go back to what I was going to talk about, which is the new feature that's coming up. So let's say that I'm going to collect some mailboxes from an Exchange environment. In this case, Metaspike is on Office 365. So I'm going to start by putting in this target mailbox. But I'm going to collect over 50 mailboxes from this Exchange server. So do I have to go through and set those acquisition sessions one at a time through the wizard, putting different email addresses each time? Well, previously you had to, but now we have this option here, a little button that says add additional targets. So what that does is, let's take a look at the file that I'm about to load here. You create a targets list file, a tab delimited text file. In this case, I have a bunch of email addresses at metaspike.com, and the only field I have is target email, because I'm not intending to override the username or the password or anything like that for those accounts, because my account is going to have delegate access or it's going to have impersonation rights. So I'm going to use delegation or impersonation to access all these other accounts through my centralized credentials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this add additional targets button, go point at that targets text file. It just loaded 51 additional targets. You have a little notification here at the top. And if you hover over this, you can see a preview of some of those, the top 5 of those additional targets that you just added. So let's go through with this acquisition that we just started. I'm going to skip over these. Let's pick a new folder. Because I chose auth, so it's popping up the Microsoft authentication screen. So I'm going to log in as the user that I started with, and the password. So the next step is to show me the folder structure in that mailbox, and it will do that. But in addition to the mailbox that I targeted, you're going to see on the bottom that 51 additional projects have been created. So those are the 51 additional mailboxes that I added as targets. So you could actually go ahead and proceed with this acquisition if you wanted to, but I'm going to stop that just so I can look at what happened there. So we were here, and I created these acquisitions. So all in all, I have 52 acquisition sessions now. So essentially FEC projects, all FEC project files. The one that I started off with is here, but because I didn't start it, I don't have any files associated with it just yet. So it just looks like a regular project file, and I have all the rest of these. So what I could do now is, if I wanted to, and the beauty of it is, let's say that I wanted to target one of these projects and get started on them, right? I can just double click on one. FEC will load it up and hit resume. And it's going to start by capturing the folder list. That happens because normally in the regular workflow, we get the folder tree view, and then you pick and choose which folders you want to target. And then based on your selection, you proceed. In this case, because you're bulk creating the mailboxes, you don't really have that option to choose folders from each individual mailbox. So what FEC is doing is it's getting the full folder listing, and then it's selecting them all and proceeding with the acquisition. So let's show a couple of additional things here. So one of the beautiful aspects of this is not only can you target these individually yourself, but you could also target them from the command line in a scripted manner. This is something we introduced recently, and I want to show this to you because this was part of one of the recent features too. So I'm going to open up a command line window, and what you do is you pass the path to your FEC executable, or if it's already in your path variable, then you don't need to do anything about that. And then I need the path to my project. So let's put the path. And then if I do this and just launch it, it'll just launch the project, but it'll do nothing. It'll just wait there. If I want to actually start it or resume it, then I could add a start parameter here and hit it. So this will launch FEC, and it'll just pick it right back. And something happened, I lost connectivity or something, then I can go back and relaunch it. And again, it'll pick back up from where it left off. So this is pretty resilient. We worked a lot on the fault tolerance already on FEC. But this just shows you that there are some opportunities there to kind of automate this large scale acquisitions and at least create a scripting based approach to either schedule things to run later or target them individually or batch target them. You could even open multiple acquisitions at the same time and go from there. So of course, one of the questions that comes up, and I'm sure it's going to come up now, is can we do something in a more streamlined manner where FEC actually handles this for you? And that's where this is going. So this was kind of a step-by-step progression if you've been following along. We started by being able to target individual mailboxes in the early version of FEC. And then we added the capabilities to do delegation and impersonation, so you could use centralized credentials for everybody in the enterprise. Now you're able to actually bulk create those projects, and then what's to come is to have some type of a queue manager that'll manage that acquisition for you, so you can just kick it off and watch it go and get some notifications along the way, possibly. So this is what the multiple target option looks like. So in this scenario, I only overrode the target email. In this case, I just specified target email addresses, but I didn't touch the username and password because my username and password, or in this case, my OAuth token, was good for the remaining email addresses. So I didn't need to specify passwords and usernames. But things change if you are doing an IMAP acquisition, for example, and you have to specify credentials, or if you're doing an exchange acquisition but you don't want to use the delegate access workflow, or you don't have the ability to use it, you just want to target users with their own credentials, then that's pretty simple. What you would do is you would go here. So in this case, you have your target email column, right? So you're going to need two more columns here. You can add username and password. Your username would most likely be along the lines of what the target email is already. And your password is going to be whatever it is for those mailboxes. So let's say something like this for the sake of argument. So let's grab this. So all you need to do is create a new target list, tab delimited. That's why I copied straight from Excel. You have target email, username, and password. You save this as a target list, and when you do this, then FEC is going to recognize that you're also overriding the username and password for each target. So it's going to use that instead of the delegate access mode or impersonation or whatever else. And this will work for both IMAP and Exchange on Office 365. And in the case of G Suite, you have delegate access option to G Suite. So you could again go back to using that single column. So set up the delegate access in the G Suite domain, bring your service account in there, give it the right access, and then just hit your targets this way and go from there. So again, this is something that will hopefully make it easier to bulk create mailboxes. We've had a lot of questions about this in the past couple of years, where you would get a project where you have an IMAP acquisition from GoDaddy or Yahoo, for example, and you have 50 or 100 or 200 mailboxes, and it's normally a hassle to create those projects manually, and it's good to be able to just automate that to an extent. So, and in the same, along the same lines, I showed you how the command line interface works currently. Right now, it's pretty simple. You just have that start option, or if you specify no option, it's just going to launch that project. If you have some needs around this in terms of automation and you want FEC to be able to do other things from the command line, then do let me know, and we can talk more about how to get that done, what else we can add there. Okay, the other thing that comes up a lot is delegate access in G Suite. So I'm gonna briefly mention that too, although we had that, but let me pause here for a second and again answer some questions that I see here. Oh, I had some suggestions here. So I have a suggestion that says that for Google Drive attachments, another thing we can do is to do a load file export. So specify the parent-child relationships in the export. And yeah, I think that is a very good idea, and that's entirely possible. What I'm trying to avoid there is the need for overlays. So, a lot of times it's possible to load things up into, let's say, Relativity or your digital forensics tool, and then overlay some information on top of it to establish your relationships or feed some additional information on there after the fact, which works fine. But a lot of users don't like that too much. They feel like it's better to have just like a push button method to get things done. So the goal there is to make it in a way that you can just throw them into the tool, and the tool will create its own parent-child relationship based on the input without any user intervention. So that's the idea behind where we want to kind of tie them together and bundle them. And I know a lot of the discovery tools and forensic tools handle that quite well, and they find that as a file, for example, they will treat that as a container and establish a relationship among the items that are within that container. In some platforms, that's optional. You could treat a container as a folder versus as a container. But in any case, we want to make that possible either through an email container or a regular archive container, but still keep the timestamps there within the container so that once they're parsed out, you get the right timestamps for the attachments and the email and all that. All right, so the one thing that I want to show you very quickly is G Suite delegation again. This is something we touched on in the last webinar too a little bit, but I want to go through it very, very quickly just to highlight a couple of points. The documentation for this is here in our knowledge base under using delegation with G Suite. This is something that trips people up a little bit because it has a couple of tricky aspects. in the setup phase. And the tricky thing is you have to do two things. Number one, you have to create a service account and get its credentials and give it the right access permissions in the G Suite domain. So you have to get it into G Suite domain and give it access to the specific scopes that we need. In this case, it's going to be email, calendar read-only, calendar events read-only, Gmail read-only, and Drive read-only. So once you add them, then your service account is ready and you export the key from there and you're good to go. So let's do a quick exercise on that and let's see if we can do an acquisition. And just to emphasize this one more time, so this Google calls this domain-wide delegation in G Suite, but really if you think about the workflow here, this is more along the lines of impersonation in Exchange than delegate access, I would say, because in delegate access and Exchange, you're setting things up in the individual user level, whereas in impersonation, it's at the company level, and here it's again at the company level. So you're bringing the service account into the G Suite admin to just go from there. So I'm gonna launch a new window here for another profile I have, and I'm gonna push this up here. All right. So the first thing I want to do is go to console.developers.google.com, log in as the company. So in this case, I'm going to collect emails from the domain forensicemailcollector.com that's on G Suite. And I want to create the service account under that domain too. So I want it to be fully under the control of that company. I don't want the service account to be mine because they should be able to turn it off when they need and have full control over it. And along those lines, you'll notice that FEC doesn't supply its own internal service account for this, because then once it's approved, other people could potentially access the same company because of that service account. So you're creating your own service account here. So let's log in there. And we have some projects here. So I have a project that's called FEC Delegation Test, but to be thorough, let's create a new project. Let's call it Delegation Test 2. Then let's select that project. Now it's still being created. So let's wait till it has been created. Okay. And then the next thing that's a little bit tricky is you got to go to library and add the right APIs for this. So in this case, I'm going to need Gmail API. So I'm going to need to enable this. And let's go back to library and add calendar API. Enable this. And now we also do Google Drive, so let's also enable Google Drive API. So this is a crucial step because these APIs determine what your project is capable of doing. So if you don't enable these APIs, then you're not going to have access to Gmail and Google Calendar and Google Drive. So next thing I want to do is go to this under IAM and admin service accounts and create a new service account. Let's call this FEC Delegation Service Account. The description is optional, but let's add something on that. So the thing that we're going to do now is we can go to the details of the service account and we can create a key. So let's do that and say create key. And there are two options, but for now we're going to choose JSON, which is what FEC takes. So I'm going to create this key. It's been saved. Let's grab this from there and move it to here. Okay, so I have my JSON file. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to click on this and I need to know the key, the unique ID of this account that's listed here. So this unique ID is going to be important for setting up our delegate access in the G Suite admin. So I'm going to copy this out here. So I have a copy of it. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to go to admin. So I went to step 2 now. I'm going to admin.google.com to G Suite admin. Again, I'm logged in as that forensic email collector admin. And what I need to do is I'm going to go to security and advanced settings and manage API client access. So here is where you actually add your client name, which is going to be the unique ID of the key here, and the API scopes. And the API scopes you can just copy and paste from our documentation on this. Essentially, these are the scopes you need for Drive and Calendar and all that. And when you do that, it says your settings have been saved. My key has been added there under all these different scopes. Let's see what it ended with here. So it's the key that ends with 437. 437, I see email, calendar events, read-only, calendar read-only, Drive read-only, and Gmail read-only. So that's all I need. And of course, when this is done and the collection efforts are complete, if you wanted to deauthorize, then you come back here and you say remove, and that removes the access. So the FEC side of things is pretty simple. So when you're going to collect emails from this G Suite domain now, you can put any target. I'm going to still put the same one here because that's the only test account I have. But you could put other end users accounts there. And you're going to use, because it's G Suite, FEC detects that it's a G Suite account, so it has this use domain-wide delegation option. So you check that, and you go and load your key that you just created. And it says private key loaded. And then you go through with this. And no browser window will open. So normally the browser window should pop up and it should ask us for credentials. But in this case, because we authorized the service account into the entire G Suite domain for those specific API scopes, then we're good to go. And we just go ahead with our acquisition here. We can pick up the calendars. We can do the Drive attachments, whatever else FEC is able to do, you can do here. So this is again another way that you could also incorporate the adding targets option and add more targets if you have them, so that you don't have to create those acquisition projects manually. But the most obvious benefit is just to create this once, and then you're good to go in terms of authentication. You don't even have to use remote authenticator to get tokens for each user individually. All right, so that's mainly what I wanted to cover today, some of the old features and some of the new features that are coming up. Like I said, you should expect an announcement for the new version of FEC next week, and we're gonna silently update Remote Authenticator very soon, probably today or tomorrow, to add that Google Drive authentication parameter. So when you do a remote authentication with FEC Remote Authenticator, it's also gonna ask for Drive access, so you can carry the token over to your FEC acquisition and request the Drive attachments there. Let me check the Q&A here in chat to see if there's anything I'm missing. There's another question here that says, do you have an estimate on how quickly or the rate of emails are collected per hour? Well, that's a good question. I don't have an estimate, frankly, because that's kind of outside of our control. It mainly depends on how big those emails are, how the server feels about giving you those emails at that moment, and what the load on the server is, the server type. Normally, when Gmail is in a good mood, I think we see about 25,000 emails an hour, which is pretty high compared to IMAP and other methods. But of course, again, that depends on the size of the emails. If each email is really large, then things can get a little slower. Likewise, if you have Google Drive attachments linked to those emails, then you're gonna have that time at the end when we're gonna pause and start fetching those Google Drive attachments, which is gonna take a little longer. Is the collection affected by Google's throttling? Yes, absolutely. Google is gonna throttle you after a while. For most regular size collections, I would say under 100,000 or so messages, I wouldn't expect to see throttling, but once it kicks in, then it's going to affect the speed at which we are seeing things. We have some throttling mitigation built in. So there's under settings, we have some automatic retries here. You'll notice some wait duration settings. So what this does is it'll actually automatically retry the acquisition, in this case 10 times, but you could set it up for more. And between each retry attempt, it'll actually put a delay, and the delay is based on responses we're getting from Google or any provider. So if things are getting a little bit tricky or throttling kicks in, then we're going to wait more and more until that subsides. And this is a good way to mitigate throttling so that we prevent it from becoming a bigger issue. If you just keep hammering without stopping, then you don't get anything. So that's kind of built in, and at the end of the acquisition, you get the notification emails telling you that your collection is done. So the goal here is to minimize the babysitting. So we want you to be able to set it and forget it, and it runs. If something goes wrong and after 10 tries it's not done, then you can go back to your project file and reopen it and resume from there. But most likely, under normal circumstances, it should finish without issue. Let's see. I think one more thing that I wanted to show while I was in the settings page, I briefly mentioned this before, but this is the new option we have for different report options. I still keep this on TSV most of the time because that's what I'm used to, but a lot of people like that for concordance or CSV to make things easier to open. So if you choose those options, they make it easier for you to export the reports in different options. And another side benefit is this, once you switch this and go back to an older project, you can re-export your reports in this new format. So if you had a project, for example, and you had all your reports in TSV format, and if you want to go back and get a CSV copy really easily, you can go back and reopen that project, hit the export logs button, and get your logs out in CSV or that format, and go from there. So that makes it easier if you want to look at it from a different angle, although you could yourself, do those conversions too with some text editor magic. I think that's it for the questions. I'm not seeing any other questions for now. There was one question that I forgot to answer, and the question was, were we planning on creating an online course? And we aren't right now, but that's something that has come to mind, not specifically about FEC, I would say, but more about email forensics. So starting from the collection side to investigations and authentication and all that. That's something that I'm clearly interested in doing, as the investigative part of it. And I would like to share that with other people. So that's something that's in the back of my mind. And if there is some interest in that, definitely let me know, and we can speed that up a little bit. But we don't have any plans to do a FEC specific course or certification or training. I feel like the tool is intuitive enough that most people can get into it really quickly. And our support is here to help people along. And we do these webinars on a regular basis. I would say about once a month or so to get everybody up to speed. So hopefully there's not a need to give you long formal training, charge for it, certify you on the product and all that. But if you feel strongly that that will be a benefit, then we can think about it. And one more question about if the documentation explains the API info and how to create. I'm assuming this is about the G Suite delegation part. So yes, we have the G Suite delegation documentation here where we explain the API scopes and everything. And this is where I copied and pasted into G Suite admin directly from our documentation. So these are the scopes that you need. You can just copy and paste this in there. And there's another piece that might be interesting to some, which is providing your own Gmail API credentials. This is not necessary, but we have a button that says provide your own API credentials for Gmail if you wanted to. So if you want to use FEC's built-in credentials and make it be seamless, then you do that and you don't have to do anything. But if you want to use your own Google app, so to speak, and use your own credentials, so when the authentication request pops up, instead of asking, are you allowing forensic email collector access to your mailbox, if you wanted to say, are you allowing XYZ consulting to something into your app with your own logo on there, then yeah, you could do that. You can create your own API credentials. We have the documentation here, and then you can bring them in to FEC and it'll happily use them. And you can just go from there. And that might be some benefit for some users on that front. All right, that's all I have for now. As always, feel free to reach out to me if any questions come up. If you have any suggestions about the things that are coming up in the pipeline, specifically, again, about Google Drive, attachment bundling, about the new search it report functionality and what you would like to see there, and about the command line options that we already have in place. But if you need any enhancements there, and new functionality to make your life easier, let me know and we'll be happy to add that up. Always available. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.